Hey, Hotel Bar Sessions listeners. We're here again for our final afterthoughts of season 3. It's a little bittersweet. It's sad to be ending season 3, but I'll tell you, we're all excited about things we got cooking for next season. But before I begin, I'm Rick Lee, your host for today, and I'm joined as usual by my lovely co-host, Dr. Charles Peterson. How are you, Charles?
I'm feeling lovely.
And Dr. Lee Johnson. How are you, Lee?
I am feeling good as well. Look at us, all just lovely, feeling good people.
I feel pretty. I feel pretty and
witty
and gay.
Right, that's right. That's going to be the name of our next podcast.
I have to say,
and gay.
That scene from Anger Management where he makes him sing that song is one of my favorite scenes of all time. Anyhow, we're here to talk about our episodes on Superstition, on the Godfather Trilogy, and our final episode, Turning Up the Heat. So let's start with Superstition. I'll start with you, Charles. You have any afterthoughts about our episode on Superstition?
I regret that we didn't use the Stevie Wonder song. Did we use that for that as a?
No, we didn't, and I feel so terrible.
Yeah, I assumed it was because of copyright worries. I hear Stevie's pretty litigious, so
right. And our huge audience we'd be a ripe target.
Exactly. But I thinking about Superstition as I tend to do, it would have been interesting. I should have talked about it in the context of particular cultural sort of experiences and backgrounds. I think would have been pretty interesting, and in the ways in which superstitions maintain a link to particular sort of cultures. I think about my mother, who was born in Mississippi, migrated to Gary, Indiana, early 60s, and her superstitions are part of her Southern past. And that's a part of our identity as a Black Southerner from a certain moment in history. So if we'd have talked about or given superstitions more of a cultural historical context, then I think that would have been interesting.
Yeah. Lee, what about you?
I mean, I think we really got in the weeds in that episode a couple times.
Wait, I have to look the chicken wing sauce off my fingers. Lee, I tried it. It didn't work for the 49ers.
I know.
I was eating chicken wings in the second half, and LA still blew them out.
Well, I think that, listening back to it, I do think that we sort of came around to an understanding, but I think where I got a little jammed up was I feel like at one point, both of you were trying to say, but if I could give a non-supernatural explanation for something, then it's not a superstition. And I was trying to say, but then you're not describing a superstition. So I do still think that a superstition involves a belief in some kind of a supernatural intervening force. But it was really interesting. I thought, despite kind of having to work our way out of the weeds of that part of the conversation, that it clarified for me why two people doing the same thing, one of them could be doing it superstitiously and one of them could be doing it in a, like loosely speaking, scientific way. And I think the example of cheering at a football game to help your team was actually a really good example. So I thought that was a lot of people have come up to me since that episode and, uninvited just told me their superstition. So I don't know. I don't know how much longer that's going to last, but for all the listeners, I don't need to know all your superstitions.
Keep it to yourself.
Right.
Yeah. And, Lee, following up from that, when I listen back and think about it, I feel like I don't want to speak for Charles, but what I was trying to push for was that clearly a superstition occupies a space where known forms of causation are not operative. That's for sure.
Right.
And I think I just got hung up on whether we should call that supernatural or not. It's just certainly unknown. The other thing is, I got a sense both in listening back and then in some of the pre-show discussions we had that Lee, you kept saying suspicion instead of superstition.
I
And
know.
I think that tells us something about what you feel about superstition.
It does. Even when I was writing not the notes for the episode, but logging the episode in, I kept typing suspicion, and I was like, why can't I get this in my head that this is not the word? But yes, in sum, I am very suspicious of superstitions.
All right, so moving on. Lee, do you love America? We're talking about The Godfather. Any thoughts about that?
I wish your first child was a masculine child. Yeah, I was the least enthusiastic. So I also was enthusiastic about talking about The Godfather, but not as much as these boys. I was probably the least enthusiastic, but I was really, really happy with the way that came out. I thought that we got into some really super interesting issues about immigration and identity and power and legitimacy and gender, and favors and a lot of other things. So I was really happy with the way that came out. I kind of, it sort of came up at the end, but re-listening back to it, I wish we had actually talked a little bit more about Vito Corleone's sort of economy of favors. That is, and how that's different from the, as Charles said, the kind of exchange economy of his sons and later everyone in America that the Corleone family interacts with. I think that at one point we said that, he had a kind of potlatchy sense of favors, and that I think would have been a really interesting longer conversation. Maybe we should have an episode on favors or gift giving or whatever at some point in the future.
Yeah, and I'll come to you in a minute, Charles, but following up from that, Lee, you're the one who brought that economy of favors up. And I wish it had, it came in at a natural point, but that was a really striking feature to me, is I hadn't thought about what that economy looks like. And then we could have poked, had we had more time, we could have poked around about the relationship between that and honor. And I thought those were really, really interesting points. And also, I said afterwards to both of you that that episode brought me to a real aporia. And I think for me, philosophically, those are some of the most exciting moments. Yeah. And so I really appreciated that episode for that.
Wait, what was the aporia?
It was the not just the question of gender, but it was when Lee said, if you're talking about Birth of a Nation, would you talk about how great it is and the technology and so on, and then 20 minutes into the conversation say, oh, by the way, it's racist as shit. We wouldn't think of doing that, but yet we talked for a long time without saying, wait a second, this is not only patriarchal, but there are some really disturbing depictions of women. And there's a lot of violence toward women. And so that moment about how to talk about a work of art in those contexts was really operatic for me. That's aporia, not operatic,
Father 3.
Like The Godfather actually is.
Right, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, I was going to say, I talked about this in the context of Shakespeare, but you're right, it's also an opera.
Yeah.
Right. And there's definitely that piece of it. My main regret is that we did not name the episode the Corleonead. I think that would have been much akin to the Henryad, right? If we're going to talk about the Shakespearean.
Oh.
Right. So, hey, Coppola, if you're hearing this, the Corleonead. I think maybe a way to repackage it. But I want to pick up on what Rick was saying about how do we talk about elements of works of art. And I wanted to sort of, I wish we had gotten deeper into the conversation of what are the criteria by which we can think about elements of art. Can we talk about something that in many ways is violent, is offensive, is deeply problematic, but still begin to talk about other ways, like the technical aspects of it, right? Can we sort of have we gotten past the ability to live with a very sort of ambivalent work in terms of various things that it presents to the viewer? And you're right, we should start saying, oh, by the way, this is a really sexist and violent, misogynistic, or has elements of that in the movie. And now we can talk about these other things the way we say, oh yeah, Birth of a Nation is definitely racist and white supremacist, but right, he creates the close-up, right, with this. So I maybe this is something for a future episode, but I want to get into how can we really sort of pick apart and think about what it means to talk about problematic works of art at this moment, especially within the context. I'm thinking about the way we talked about cancel culture, right, in previous episodes, right? Can we dig into that? So that's what I think I should have pushed more for.
Yeah, I mean, if I could just follow up, I think that, it's problematic for me too. I mean, I also love the Godfather movies. And I also, when I talk about the Godfather movies, don't begin by saying this incredibly misogynistic film that I love for other reasons, The Godfather. So,
I'm not doing myself any favors by saying, oh yeah, Birth of a Nation, what a really amazing film. I'm not winning any friends in my department with that.
But I do, I mean, I've thought a lot about it since we recorded, and I do think that one of the, as Rick says, one of the kind of sort of operatic problem, nature of this question, with the Godfather in particular, is that it's not as if this is a great film with great characters that also involves, as part of the plot line, misogyny and violence towards women and patriarchy. What makes the story great and what makes the characters great is the patriarchy and misogyny and violence towards women. And it's, I've really tried to think a lot about how would I tease those out, and I'm just not sure that in this instance, they're not too tangled up to tease out. But like Rick said, I also, if I had to sort of force myself to a point to say, like, I'm gonna stop saying I love this film, it would make me sad to not love this film.
So you prefer a world without Shakespeare above a world without The Godfather?
Well, and since you brought that up, that's a question that came up in our last episode, Turning Up the Heat. So Charles, I'll go to you first. You have any afterthoughts about when we all took turns in the hot seat and we turned it up? We were at broil for a little while in that episode.
Well, as I've said to both of you offline, and now once again, my fixation with renaming things, I wish we had named the episode The Third Degree.
That's a good one.
Because that's what I was trying to get to in terms of a certain type of interrogation. So that, I believe we could have asked a million questions, and I actually wish that I'd asked more questions in terms of how to rank things, more sort of directed toward to Rick and his aesthetic choices, right? I think there were some questions I left off because I thought other questions would substitute for that, but I didn't. So I would have gone more of the ranking. That was kind of my favorite part of the whole conversation.
Lee, what about you?
I mean, that was a lot of fun, first of all. Like, I would love to do that again next season or at some point in the future. Yeah, there were a couple moments that surprised me in your answers, but two in particular things that I want to get back, two questions I want to get back to with each of you.
Are you going to relitigate this? Is that what you're doing?
That means we were wrong, Charles.
You're going to pull out the verbal rubber hose and really, I want the truth.
But with Charles, I was really actually surprised at your answer that you would rather be able to not speak and read than not read and speak. Because so many times, first of all, because you're such an amazing conversationalist.
Thank you.
And second of all, because so many times you've talked about your attachment, not only to the kind of dialogic sense of, teaching and learning, but also of philosophy itself. So, and to me, it just seems like, it's not as if in the 21st century, if you couldn't read the written word, that you couldn't read. I mean, you wouldn't be able to have literature, right? Like, you could still listen to it. You could watch television, whatever, movies or whatever. But I'm just my question for you first is, are you sticking with that answer? Really, you'd rather not speak?
I want the truth.
Ladies and
can't
gentlemen of
handle
the
the truth.
jury, I ask you again, dear sir.
It's really, I mean, I understand, they have audio books and where you can listen to things. But there are 2 points that I'm still really in love with: the physical act of touching a book, a text, and turning pages. I'm reading Graham Greene's novel, The Heart of the Matter, and it's the newest edition. And I love the texture of the pages, right? And it's the pages that have like the rigid sort of edges. It's not smooth, but it's like, right? So I love that. So it's that tactile relationship. Be outside of any physical member of my family, books were probably my first and earliest comfort. Right. And so I feel like emotionally I would lose a lot by not being able to have that way of removing myself, or sort of expanding sort of a way I think about the world, or being able to create quiet time for myself. Like losing all of that means a lot to me. Clearly I like to talk. But I'm not sure I get as much emotional comfort from talking as I do from reading.
Okay, well, I mean, that makes sense. I can't imagine you not being able to do either. So like I feel like that was a really tough choice. But Rick, I also want to come back to a question for you, because you 100% cheated on a question that I asked you, which was the one about would you rather only speak to people on social media, or not be able to only speak to people in person, but not be able to know what's on social media? Because the way that I set it up, the whole idea was that either you can know everything about the world, but you only can communicate with other people through social media, or you can communicate with other people face to face, but you can't know anything about the content of social media. So that means anything that happens on social media would be like redacted from your conversation. Like you literally couldn't know about, nobody could talk to you about it. And the reason I asked this question this way was because so many times you've said that even though you don't like social media, it's a part of real life, and it finds its way into our regular offline conversations and the way that our regular offline world is shaped. And so I was trying to really push at that, but I think that you just missed that part of the question. So now I want to ask it again.
Well, so, I mean, one of the things that makes the would you rather questions fun is that they're often, I mean, some of them are just ridiculous choices, but some of them are often like impossible choices. And I think this is one of them. I think this is really an impossible choice. But my main worry is that the way in which social media affects me is so personally destructive that I'd rather not hear anything about what goes on in social media than that be my only way of interacting with human beings in the world. That so horrifies me that I still would choose the same, even though I think it's so what I'm saying is I would lose information about a really important part of our world. And I think I'm willing to give that up. Besides, Lee, you would secretly tell me what was going on.
He would be a Twitter whisperer.
Rick's like, Lee never follows the rules.
Right. Charles, do you have any afterthoughts about the Turning Up the Heat episode?
No, I thought it was great fun. I wouldn't, despite the whole purpose of this episode, I actually wouldn't change a single thing. As we talked about, it kind of did feel a little initially self-indulgent, but I think the way that we approached a lot of the questions and the chance to discuss and defend and critique each other around the answers, I think made it a full-blown normative Hotel Bar Sessions podcast.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, and for the listener / viewer, since this is going to be also a video, I mention a lot that the three of us do talk outside of the podcast, and I felt like that was an episode that captured a little bit more of who we are together, and how we engage with one another. And I think sometimes when I'm listening to a podcast, I appreciate knowing a little bit more about the hosts of the podcast from different perspectives. And so I think, if we did that every episode, then my mom would be our only listener. And in fact, she would stop because she doesn't like when I do swears. But
wait, how does she ever listen to any episodes?
Right.
By the way, she only listened to the first two, and she's like, I just don't like hearing you swear so much.
Oh,
So that's right.
Like Lee and I, we've become like the bad kids in your neighborhood now.
Right.
she's like, no more hanging out with that Charles.
Right. I know that Charles and Lee, they're just terrible. Do they kiss their mothers with those mouths?
If they jumped off a cliff, would you, Rick?
Well, my mom had a way of washing our mouths out with soap, like bar soap.
Like literally?
Yeah. And she would scrape the soap on your teeth as it was exiting your mouth.
I've had that done.
Yeah.
I'm gonna start calling you Ralphie. That's your nickname, Ralphie.
All right. Well, so as I said, this is our last Afterthoughts for season 3. Before we end, I want to say, for those of you who have supported us on Patreon, thank you so much. It really does help us a great deal. As we keep saying, we love doing this and we would do it for free. And in fact, we do. But there are costs involved in this. And so we're not asking to get rich. We're just asking not to get poor. And so
I'm asking to get rich. I didn't even know that was an option. Can we ask for that?
Famous economists say there are no free podcasts. I think I remember reading that in my high school econ class.
Well, and our ad team is still working on Tito's and yeah. So
and big logic.
Big Logic, Big Humanities. We're still trying to get an ad from them. But really, to all of our Patreon supporters, thank you so much. If you're not a Patreon supporter and you have the means, please help us defray some of the costs. If you don't have the means, that's cool. We love you. We love your support anyhow. So I just wanted
all those links are below this video, in the links below.
Yeah. And with that, let me turn it over to each of you. Any last thoughts about season 3, opening season 4? Lee, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I don't know if you said this, but just for our listeners, we do take a few weeks break in between seasons, so it'll probably be second week of March before we come back with season 4. I am really excited about season 4. We've got some cool interviews lined up, a lot of good topics lined up. So yeah, definitely stick with us. And I've got these 2 jokers back for another season.
Joker, what say you?
I'm a Heath Ledger type of Joker, if anybody wants to know. I feel like Rick would go with the Cesar Romero.
I would. I definitely would.
Yeah. So I'm a Heath Ledger. No, everything that everyone has said, there's no need for me to be redundant. I'm excited about season 4 because I'm still on the high of what we've done in season 3, opening up new doors. I bring in really interesting, exciting guests who punch up our conversations. And who knows where this takes us in the next iteration.
I'm excited to see who our new bartender is.
Yes.
So with that, thank you all for listening through season 3. Thank you both, Lee and Charles. And I think we're out of here. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.